Wladyslaw Szpilman is a pianist working at a local radio station in Warsaw, Poland in 1939 when Germany invades the country. The German army defeats Poland in just 3 weeks, and while Szpilman is playing live on the radio, the building is bombed. Everyone runs for their lives. Outside, Szpilman runs into his friend Zurek, who introduces him to his sister Dorota. She says she came just to meet him and tells him she loves the way he plays piano. The attraction is mutual. When Szpilman gets home, his family is packing to leave, but at that moment, they hear that the United Kingdom and France have declared war on Germany. Hoping the conflict will end soon, they decide to stay. But things quickly get worse for Jews in Warsaw. The Nazis impose harsh restrictions. They're not allowed to have more than 2,000 zlotys, walk in the park, use the sidewalk, or enter restaurants. They also have to wear an armband identifying them as Jews every time they go outside. Later on, Szpilman calls his friend Jurek to go out with his sister Dorota. Wladek meets up with her, and they walk through Warsaw. She plays the cello. He tells her that meeting her on the day of the bombing was special. He'll never forget it. They go to a cafe, but are denied entry for being Jewish. Dorota is outraged, while Wladek criticizes the owners, saying they're trying to be more Nazi than Hitler. With no other option, Wladek and Dorota stay outside, talking. Meanwhile, Wladek's father is walking on the sidewalk when 2 Nazi officers stop him for not greeting them. They beat him and order him never to walk there again. Things continue to deteriorate when the Nazis create a ghetto to relocate all Jewish families. So, on October 31st, 1940, the Szpilman family, along with thousands of other Jews, is moved into the ghetto, which is cut off from the rest of the city by a wall. Before the war, the Szpilmans were financially stable. Now they barely survive. Still, they're better off than many others in the ghetto where hunger and disease are spreading. Wladek and his brother Henrik try to make some money by selling books, but it doesn't go well. Henrik complains that others are getting rich by bribing guards and sneaking in carts full of food, tobacco, liquor, and cosmetics, while the poor are dying. Back at home, they're visited by Heller, a Jewish police officer and friend of Henrik. He suggests they join the police to avoid trouble and improve their family's situation. Henrik refuses, saying he could never beat his own people. Szpilman declines too, saying he already has a job. He plays piano at a restaurant inside the ghetto where the wealthier Jews gather. Meanwhile, conditions in the ghetto get worse. Many die each day from illness, starvation, or violence at the hands of German soldiers. Wladek is unhappy with his job and wants to help his community. After work, he visits Yehuda, a friend who distributes underground newspapers to incite rebellion against the Nazis. But Yehuda turns him down, saying musicians don't make good conspirators. On his way home, Wladek sees a boy being beaten by Nazi soldiers as he tries to crawl back into the ghetto through a hole under the wall. Wladek manages to drag him inside, but the boy doesn't wake up. Now I'd like to begin my commentary. This time I want to go deeper into the real events portrayed in the film, starting with the Warsaw Ghetto. The word ghetto was first used in 1516 in Venice, Italy, when local authorities forced the Jewish community to live in a segregated neighborhood. That neighborhood was located near an old copper foundry, which is why many believe the word comes from the Venetian verb gettare, meaning to throw or to cast. Throughout the 15th and 16th centuries, cities like Rome, Frankfurt, and Prague followed suit, creating ghettos for their Jewish populations, often surrounded by walls and governed by restrictive laws. Over time, the word ghetto came to refer to any area where Jewish people lived in groups, though not always by force. However, during World War II, the Germans co-opted the term to describe the areas where they forcibly relocated Jews in the occupied cities. The idea of building sealed ghettos was proposed during a meeting on November 12, 1938, when Hermann Göring suggested completely isolating Jews from German society. At its core, the ghetto system wasn't just about separation, it was about confinement. The plan was to keep Jews locked within the Eastern territories until the Nazis decided on a final solution. In the heart of Warsaw, the Germans built the largest ghetto in Europe. Before the war, 375,000 Jews lived in the city, making up nearly a third of the population. But after the German invasion in September 1939, their lives changed forever. A year later, in October 1940, the Germans announced the creation of the Warsaw Ghetto. Thousands of Jews were forced into an area that occupied just 2.4% of the city. A 3-meter-high wall topped with barbed wire surrounded the ghetto. No one could enter or leave without special permission, effectively turning it into an open-air prison. Inside the ghetto, surviving was a daily battle. At its peak, 450,000 people, including 85,000 children under the age of 14, were crammed into a tiny space with up to 10 people sharing a single room. Most had no job or steady income, so street trading became a necessity. Everything was bartered: clothes, bread, even the most trivial items. Anything that could be exchanged for food had value, just like we saw with Władek and Henrik selling books to survive. Lack of hygiene and bitter cold turned the ghetto into a breeding ground for disease. Typhus and other epidemics spread out of control, while food was almost non-existent. The rations allocated by the Germans were shockingly insufficient, barely a tenth of what a person needed to survive. The only way to get more food was through smuggling, mostly carried out by children who risked their lives sneaking into the Aryan side for supplies, like the boy Wladek tried to save. Without medicine, without enough food, and under freezing conditions, thousands died of hunger, cold, and illness. Between October 1940 and July 1942, nearly 92,000 people perished inside the ghetto, almost 20% of the population. Desperate, many tried to escape, but the Nazis responded with brutal force. Anyone caught outside the ghetto without permission was executed on the spot. So was anyone who dared to shelter them. A German public notice made the consequences crystal clear. Jews who leave the assigned sector without permission will be sentenced to death. The same punishment applies to anyone who knowingly shelters them. That night, as the Szpilman family eats dinner, Henryk and Wladek argue. Henryk criticizes Wladek for playing piano for the ghetto's elite, people who don't care about the suffering around them. Suddenly, they see Nazi soldiers storm into a building across the street and seize a family. The officer in charge orders everyone to stand up, but an elderly man in a wheelchair can't. The soldiers pick him up and throw him off the balcony. They then drag the rest of the family into the street and execute them. The wounded are run over with a military vehicle. The Szpilman family watches in horror. The next day, Helena, Wladek's sister, finds him at work and tells him that the Nazis are arresting people in the streets and that Henryk has been taken. Wladek rushes to find him and pleads with Heller to let him go. At first, the Jewish police officer refuses, but eventually agrees to help. Later, Henryk tells Wladek that deportations to forced labor camps are about to begin, and the only way to avoid them is by getting a work certificate to labor for the Germans inside the ghetto. Wladek manages to secure certificates for his family, except for his father. He asks Yehuda for help, who in turn instructs Majorek, a former soldier, to get him a job in a clothing workshop. But despite having the certificate, on March 15, 1942, the family is forced to leave their home and is taken to a warehouse along with other Jews. One night, a soldier bursts in and orders everyone to the courtyard. They've been selected for forced labor camps. He separates Henryk and Helena, who are taken away by German soldiers, and orders the rest of the group to pack up. They're moved to a square where hundreds of Jews, including children, are waiting for transport. Henryk and Helena arrive too, and the family is briefly reunited. Their father spends their last 20 zlotys on a single piece of candy, cuts it into 6 pieces, and shares it with everyone. Soon after, the train arrives and Jewish families are forced to board. Wladek tells Helena he wishes he had gotten to know her better. Just as he's about to board the train, Heller recognizes Wladek, pulls him out of the line, and tells him to run. Wladek doesn't understand and insists on staying with his family, but Heller warns him that he just saved his life. With no other choice, Wladek runs off reluctantly as his family boards the train. The deportations we've just seen are part of what was known as the Gross Action Warsaw, a major Nazi operation carried out in the summer of 1942 in which thousands of Jews were sent from the Warsaw Ghetto to the Treblinka extermination camp. To carry out this operation, the Nazis forced the Jewish police to round up their own people for deportation, just like we saw Heller do in the film. But what was the story behind these Jewish police officers? In the major ghettos, the Nazis set up what they called a Judenrat, a Jewish council forced to enforce their orders. The council also oversaw the Jewish police force, which was made up of around 2,000 volunteers. Most were well-educated young men from upper-class families who saw the job as their best chance to survive. They didn't get paid, and in some cases, they even had to pay to join. At first, their responsibilities were basic, directing traffic, overseeing sanitation, and keeping order inside the ghetto. But in 1941, they were used to round up forced laborers, and a year later, they were ordered to help carry out mass deportations. Many of these officers faced deep moral dilemmas. They were promised protection for themselves and their families in exchange for following orders. Some believed that by cooperating, they could at least reduce the suffering, ensuring that people with work permits would be spared. Others thought that if the Germans carried out the raids themselves, the brutality would be far worse. But their involvement in the deportations made them one of the most hated groups inside the ghetto. Eventually, the truth became clear. They had no real protection. Once the Nazis were done using them, they would be sent to Treblinka too. Many deserted, tried to hide, or sought shelter in the workshops of the ghetto. In response, the Nazis increased the pressure, threatening to deport their families unless they met the daily quota of arrests. By September 21, 1942, when the most brutal phase of the deportations ended, around 300,000 Jews from the ghetto, including most of the Jewish police and their families, had been sent to Treblinka and murdered in the gas chambers. Of the 500,000 Jews who once lived in the Warsaw Ghetto, only about 50,000 remained, mostly factory workers deemed useful to the Nazi war effort. Roughly 200 Jewish police officers survived, but their future was anything but secure. After escaping, Wladek looks for Yehuda, but finds his entire family dead in front of their house. Later, he returns to the restaurant where he used to work and finds it deserted. Just as he's about to leave, his former boss, Benk, calls to him from a hiding spot and asks him to come in. He explains they have to stay hidden there for a few days until a bribed police officer helps them escape. Later, Benk and Wladek blend in with the 50,000 Jews who are still left in the ghetto, just 10% of those who once lived there. Their new job is to tear down brick walls and build apartments for non-Jewish residents who are moving in. While working under harsh and cruel conditions, Wladek briefly spots an old friend, Janina, but she quickly disappears into the crowd. Then, as the group marches, a soldier stops them, selects several, including Benk, and executes them on the spot. Sometime later, during another work shift, Wladek discovers that some Jews are planning an uprising against the Nazis. He offers to help by smuggling weapons into the ghetto. On another occasion, he drops some bricks while carrying them, and a Nazi commander beats him viciously. After that, he's reassigned to distributing construction materials. In this new role, he also helps smuggle weapons hidden in sacks of potatoes for the resistance outside the ghetto walls. Wladek wants to escape to the city and asks Majorek, who leaves the ghetto every day, for help contacting Janina. One day, an officer suspects that Wladek is hiding something in a sack of beans, but after opening it, he finds nothing, even though the weapons were right there. Wladek needs to leave urgently, and Majorek tells him he's finally reached Janina. Wladek should get ready. He eventually escapes from the labor camp and reunites with Janina and her husband, who welcome him warmly. After feeding him and giving him clean clothes, Janina's husband takes him to Gebsinski, who offers him shelter for the night. The next day, Gebsinski guides him to an empty apartment near the ghetto wall where Wladek can survive on smuggled food. He warns him to remain completely silent. Non-Jewish neighbors believe the place is abandoned. Before leaving, he gives Wladek an emergency address. On April 19, 1943, from the apartment window, Wladek witnesses the beginning of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, an event he had helped support by smuggling in weapons. Days later, he watches the revolt being crushed. By May 16, 1943, all of his comrades have been killed by the Germans. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was the first urban rebellion against the Germans in occupied Europe. After the mass deportations of summer 1942, the Jewish leadership realized the situation was hopeless. They knew the Germans wouldn't stop, and that if they didn't fight back, they would all eventually be sent to extermination camps. So they began to organize, reaching out to the Polish resistance outside the ghetto for weapons and support. But their early attempts were unsuccessful. Left with no other option, they started collecting money from the Jewish community to buy weapons on the black market, paying steep prices. Their fears were confirmed when, on January 18, 1943, the Germans re-entered the ghetto for another wave of deportations. But this time, they didn't find defenseless people. The resistance responded immediately. Some fighters who had been captured at the Umschlagplatz, the deportation site, turned on their captors, breaking ranks and opening fire. In workshops and homes, armed fighters attacked the Nazis as they tried to enter. Others managed to escape and hide until the raid was over. The Germans occupied the ghetto until January 22nd. In those days, over 1,000 Jews were killed and 4,500 were deported, but the resistance held strong. For the first time, the Nazis realized that Warsaw would not go down without a fight. They had to enter the ghetto like it was a battlefield, using small tanks, light artillery, and machine guns. German soldiers were so terrified they refused to enter apartments without first sending in scouts. That confrontation proved that resistance was possible, and it motivated other resistance groups outside the ghetto to support them with weapons and ammunition, though only in limited quantities. The success of the resistance in January infuriated the Nazis. On April 19, 1943, on the eve of Passover and the day before Hitler's birthday, Commander Jürgen Stroop launched a massive offensive to liquidate the ghetto once and for all, just as we saw in the film. Early that morning, the Jewish fighters took their positions, ready to resist to the very end. On April 20th, the Germans began setting buildings on fire, trying to force Jews out of hiding. On April 21st, they gave the resistance an ultimatum to surrender, but the fighters refused and continued the battle with the few weapons and explosives they had left. The fighting was intense for 5 straight days. Realizing they couldn't defeat the insurgents through direct confrontation, the Nazis shifted tactics. Instead of battling the resistance head-on, they began burning the entire ghetto to the ground. Over the following weeks, thousands died trapped in burning buildings or while attempting to flee. To flush out those hiding in bunkers and sewers, the Germans used poisonous gas. As people came out choking and gasping for air, they were captured, stripped of their belongings, and, in most cases, either executed on the spot or deported by train to extermination camps. On May 8, 1943, after 19 days of fighting, the Nazis surrounded the resistance's headquarters. Inside was Mordecai Anielewicz, one of the uprising's leaders, along with about 100 fighters. When the Germans released gas into the bunker, Anielewicz and his comrades chose to take their own lives rather than surrender. In his final letter to fellow resistance leader Yitzhak Zuckerman, he wrote, "The dream of my life has come true. I've lived to see Jewish resistance in all its grandeur and glory. Hundreds of Jews died in the fires, and the remaining survivors were deported to concentration camps. In total, 42,000 people were deported. By May 16, 1943, the Warsaw Ghetto was in ruins. The Nazis had fulfilled their promise to wipe it out completely. Nothing remained but rubble and ashes. The ghetto, once home to the largest Jewish community in Europe, had been reduced to a shadow of what it once was. Janina visits Wladek and tells him to feel proud of the Jews who resisted. He believes it was all in vain, but she insists they died with dignity. She also tells him the Polish people are preparing to rise up and fight. Days later, Gebzinski arrives at the apartment and warns Wladek that he must leave. The Gestapo has found the weapons and arrested Janina and her husband. The apartment could be discovered at any moment. Still, Wladek decides to stay. Months pass and Wladek remains hidden in the same place. One night, hunger keeps him awake and he searches for food desperately. In doing so, he breaks several dishes and makes noise. A non-Jewish woman, suspecting someone is inside, threatens to call the police, forcing Wladek to flee. He manages to escape and goes to the emergency address Gebzinski had given him. There, he finds Dorota, now married and pregnant. When he asks about her brother, she tells him he died. Later, Michal, Dorota's husband, arrives. He gives Wladek food and takes him to an abandoned apartment where he can hide. Inside, there's a piano, but Michal warns him to stay completely silent. No one knows he's there. Michal introduces Wladek to Shalas, who will bring him food. At first, Shalas brings it regularly, but eventually he stops coming and Wladek becomes gravely ill with jaundice and grows weaker. Dorota and Michal visit, and after seeing his condition, they bring food and call a doctor. The doctor recommends rest. Before leaving, Dorota tells him she's moving with her mother to Otwock and warns that uprisings are about to begin. Wladek recovers just in time to witness the Warsaw Uprising of 1944, when the Polish resistance attempts to retake the city. But the Germans attack the building where he's hiding and he's forced to flee once again. He takes refuge in an abandoned hospital and scavenges for food. His condition is desperate and he imagines himself playing the piano. Soon the Germans begin burning the city, forcing him to run yet again. He climbs the wall into the former ghetto, now a desolate landscape of ruins and debris. The Warsaw Uprising was part of Operation Tempest, a plan by the Polish government in exile to organize armed insurrections in various Nazi-occupied cities. Initially, Warsaw wasn't on the list, but the Soviet advance during the summer of 1944 pushed resistance leaders to make a last-minute decision to rise up before the Red Army arrived. Their goal was to drive out the Germans, demonstrate the legitimacy of the Polish government in exile, and prevent Stalin from installing a communist regime in Poland. But for the uprising to succeed, they needed military support from the Red Army. That meant the uprising had to coincide with the Soviets' arrival in Warsaw and the Germans' retreat. On July 27, 1944, the Red Army was just 50 kilometers from Warsaw. The leaders of the Polish Home Army, AK, believed Soviet support was imminent. 2 days later, Soviet tanks moved into Warsaw's eastern suburbs and tested German defenses. For the resistance, it was time to act. On July 31st, Tadeusz Komorowski, commander of the AK, gave the final order. The uprising would begin on August 1st at 5 p.m. That morning, Warsaw was filled with tension and excitement. The insurgents, still dressed in civilian clothes, made their way to meeting points, many hiding weapons under heavy coats despite the summer heat. For security reasons, the public hadn't been informed in advance, but as soon as the first shots were fired, the city came alive with rebellion. After nearly 5 years of Nazi occupation, the people longed for freedom and revenge. Within hours, Warsaw had become a battlefield. Civilians of all ages joined the uprising. Men, women, and children helped however they could. They built barricades with paving stones, furniture, and overturned vehicles. Streetcars were used to block roads, sewers became escape routes, and factories turned into makeshift armories. From balconies, people threw Molotov cocktails at German tanks, while young messengers dashed between barricades carrying ammunition and crucial information. On August 3rd, Komorowski informed the Polish government in exile that morale was at an all-time high. He described the uprising as more of a revolution than a military operation, driven by passion and determination that made up for the lack of weapons and training. By August 5th, spirits reached their peak. In the first 5 days, the insurgents had seized 125 square kilometers and outnumbered the Germans 3-1. Victory seemed within reach, but that optimism was built on a false hope, the belief that the Soviets were about to enter the city. Radio broadcasts claimed the Red Army was in Praga, the eastern district of Warsaw, but it was a lie. Stalin had ordered the Soviet advance to stop at the Vistula River, leaving the insurgents completely alone. No reinforcements, no weapons, no supplies. Warsaw was on its own. The Germans regrouped and launched a brutal counter-offensive. What had begun as a cry for freedom quickly turned into a massacre. For Nazi leaders, the Warsaw Uprising was the perfect excuse to destroy the Polish capital once and for all. Heinrich Himmler made this clear in his own words: "Warsaw will be liquidated. This city, which for centuries has blocked our path to the east, will cease to exist. Likewise, the Polish people will cease to be a problem for future generations." With Hitler's approval, on August 1st, 1944, the Warsaw Order was issued. It declared that the city must be razed to the ground and all all its inhabitants killed to serve as a terrifying example for the rest of Europe. Himmler put General von dem Bach in charge, giving him explicit instructions: eliminate everyone, men, women, and children. Destroy the city completely. On August 5th, the Nazi repression began with one of the most horrific massacres of World War II. Under the command of Heinz Rheinefarth, SS troops, along with the infamous Durlwanger Brigade, made up of criminals and convicts, and the Kaminsky Brigade, Russian collaborators, ravaged the districts of Wola and Ochota. Thousands of civilians tried to hide in basements and courtyards, but the Luftwaffe bombed the area with incendiary explosives. Flames engulfed entire buildings, and witnesses reported that the sky turned black with ashes. People trapped in the fires jumped from windows as SS troops threw grenades into shelters and shot those trying to flee. That same day, the Polish Home Army attempted a counterattack in what became known as Black Saturday, but the thick smoke made it impossible to coordinate a defense. The Germans continued torching entire neighborhoods, factories, and homes, executing residents en masse. Execution sites were set up at tram stations, factories, and parks where thousands were systematically shot. The Durlwanger Brigade became notorious for its extreme cruelty, murdering children, raping women, and wiping out everyone in an orphanage and a hospital. In Ochota, just south of Wola, the Kaminsky Brigade carried out a similar wave of terror. Almost all young men were executed, and thousands of civilians were locked in an old marketplace turned makeshift concentration camp. More than 20,000 people were crammed together without food, water, or shelter, left to await their fate. In just 2 days, between August 5th and 6th, 1944, between 35,000 and 50,000 civilians were murdered in Wola and Ochota. After annihilating those districts, the Nazis turned their offensive toward Warsaw's historic Old Town, where thousands of fighters and civilians continued to resist. On August 11th, the siege began, but the Germans faced fierce opposition. Warsaw was a medieval fortress with narrow streets, thick walls, and a network of underground tunnels and basements. At first, the Germans struggled to take the outer streets of the old town, and many civilians inside the walled city believed they were safe. They thought the resistance could hold out, but by the third week of August, reality hit hard. The Germans had completely surrounded the city and launched an unrelenting siege. The Luftwaffe dropped over 1,580 tons of bombs with no fear of retaliation. Stalin had refused to help the Poles. Every morning, the bombers took off promptly at 6 a.m., strafing civilians and dropping bombs every half hour. At noon, the pilots took a lunch break, then resumed the destruction until 7 p.m. The result was catastrophic. Hundreds of men, women, and children were killed, trapped in flames, or crushed by falling rubble. Historic buildings were reduced to ashes. One witness described the horror. The fire burns everywhere. It's so hot the asphalt melts. The houses are on fire, groaning, creaking, and collapsing. Nothing can help at this point. With each passing day, survival became harder. By mid-August, the Germans had cut off the water supply, and the rains never came. Searching for food became a matter of life or death. Thousands took refuge in bunkers and sewers, enduring horrific conditions without water, hygiene, or hope. Hunger, disease, and exhaustion began to shatter what remained of the city's morale. At first, the people supported the uprising, but after 3 weeks with no sign of Soviet aid, the mood shifted. People began to blame the Home Army, AK, for their suffering. Polish soldiers watched as admiration turned to resentment and hatred. After 63 days of fighting on October 2nd, 1944, the resistance leaders had no choice but to surrender. But the nightmare didn't end there. Over the next 3 months, the Germans deported 650,000 civilians to labor camps and destroyed what was left of the city. By January 1945, between 85% and 90% of Warsaw lay in ruins. According to historian Maciej Siekierski, when Soviet troops finally liberated the city, there was nothing left. Poland's capital was a vast desert of empty buildings and rubble. The Warsaw Uprising ended in absolute disaster. 150,000 civilians died, along with 20,000 AK fighters. The Germans also suffered 10,000 casualties, but the city was completely devastated. After the German retreat in January 1945, the Soviets took control and established a communist regime in Poland, erasing the possibility of the independent government that so many Poles had fought and died for. Wladek hides among the burned buildings, searching for food and surviving until one night he's discovered by Nazi Captain Wilhelm Hosenfeld. Hosenfeld asks who he is and what he does. Wladek answers that he was a pianist. The captain asks him to prove it. He takes him to a piano, and for the first time in years, Wladek plays a beautiful piece. Moved, Hosenfeld decides to help him, hiding him in an attic and bringing food regularly. On one visit, Hosenfeld leaves him bread and says he just needs to hold on for 2 more weeks. The Russians are almost there. As the Red Army approaches Warsaw, the captain and his men are forced to flee. Before leaving, he gives Wladek food and his coat, remarking that Szpilman is a perfect name for a pianist. Days later, Wladek sees Polish partisans and runs to greet them. But when they notice he's wearing a German coat, they mistake him for the enemy and open fire. He surrenders and approaches, eventually convincing them that he's Polish and getting them to stop shooting. Months later, Hosenfeld is captured by the Russians along with other German soldiers and taken to a detention camp. There, a group of Polish Jews had just been liberated. Hearing that one of them is a musician, Hosenfeld approaches and asks if he knows Wladek. When the man says yes, Hosenfeld tells him that he helped hide Wladek and asks for help. Wladek returns to the radio station in Warsaw to play the piano. One day, the Polish musician arrives and tells him about Hosenfeld. Together, they go looking for him, but find that the entire camp has been moved, leaving no trace. In the end, Wladek performs Chopin's Grand Polonaise Brillante in a concert with a full orchestra. Wladek lived in Warsaw until his death on July 6, 2000, at the age of 88. Hosenfeld died in a Soviet camp in 1952. Wladek survived because in the midst of the worst nightmare imaginable, hands reached out to him, people who chose compassion over fear. Yehuda helped him get work permits, his boss Beck protected him when everything was falling apart, Majorek helped him escape, Janina and her husband gave him shelter, Dorota and her husband hid him, and finally Hosenfeld saved him when all hope seemed lost. Each one of them risked their lives with no guarantees. They didn't know if helping him would make a difference, but they did it anyway. Because in a world where cruelty had become the norm, their choice was an act of resistance against dehumanization. When the world loses its humanity, it's these gestures that keep it alive. And more than saving a life, it's about remembering that life still has value. That even in the darkest times, choosing kindness is what sets us apart from the beasts. It's perhaps the only thing that keeps us human. In this video, I wanted to include a lot of the real historical context behind the events portrayed in the film because I believe it's deeply important to understand the horrors of war and what happens when hatred and division are allowed to grow unchecked. This feels especially relevant today at a time when we're seeing certain ideas, divisions, and resentments resurface, ideas that echo even faintly those that laid the foundation for one of the darkest chapters in human history. Some may think I'm exaggerating, but the truth is that you often don't realize where you are until you've already arrived. These things don't happen all at once. They happen slowly, step by step. It starts with beliefs about a group that spread, that catch on, that become accepted as truth. Then come the restrictions, the segregation, and we all know what follows. None of it was planned to go that far from the beginning, but one step led to the next. That's why today, we can't afford to forget. We can choose to learn from those who came before us instead of walking the same road again. And more importantly, the future depends on what we choose to learn from it. We have the chance to do things differently, to not be swept away by indifference, to not let hatred blind us, because if history has taught us anything, it's that hate destroys, but memory can save us. And now, more than ever, we need to remember.